The room hummed with tension, a sterile expanse of glass and steel that overlooked the scorched surface of Earth's capital. Joe Garner sat at the oval table's center, his expression unreadable. Around him, the diplomatic council murmured in low voices, their polished composure cracking under the weight of the news. The message had come an hour earlier, intercepted by Earth's intelligence network. A routine communication from a galactic empire commander had revealed what Joe had long suspected, but hoped to be wrong about. The peace was over. The colonies on Europa and Proxima Centauri are gone. The Council's communications director broke the silence, his voice trembling. He was younger than most at the table, and the weight of the words seemed to age him in real time. Joe's jaw clenched, the faint twitch of muscle the only sign of his growing fury. The man they called Earth's silver tongue had spent the last decade brokering the fragile peace that now lay shattered. 10 years of treaties, negotiations, and measured compromises, all for nothing. How many casualties? Joe asked, his voice cutting through the rising tide of dread. Millions, another council member replied, her tone heavy with defeat. The attack was surgical. Military outposts first, followed by civilian hubs. Proxima's comms went dark 2 hours ago. Europa was hit harder. The room fell silent again. Outside, a thin veil of clouds drifted over the charred cityscape, casting fleeting shadows. Joe had spent his career navigating situations like this, though never one so dire. He had been Earth's diplomat, its advocate, its shield. He had fought with words when others demanded weapons. Now, as he sat listening to the grim reports, he felt the unfamiliar weight of failure. They violated the accord, he said finally, his voice sharp. They've made their choice. Joe, interjected Martin Greaves, the council's senior advisor, his tone cautious. We don't have the fleet to retaliate. The accord was always our safeguard. Without it, we're exposed. Joe turned his piercing gaze on Greaves. You think I don't know that? I wrote half the damn accord. But you don't stop a bully by groveling. If we don't respond, they'll grind us into the dust. Diplomacy takes time. We don't have time. Joe's voice rose, and the council visibly recoiled. We've spent years bending over backward to keep them at the table. And what did that get us? Millions dead. Our colonies turned to ash. For a moment, no one spoke. Joe leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. He hated losing control, hated letting them see the cracks in his armor. But the truth burned in his chest. The Empire hadn't just broken the peace. They had broken him. He thought of Europa, its domed cities glittering against the icy expanse, now silenced forever. He thought of the people he had met there, the scientists, engineers, and families who had believed in the promise of a peaceful future. Promises he had made. Let's not be hasty, Greaves pressed, his tone softening. We can still appeal to the neutral systems, if we gather enough support. They'll debate us into extinction, Joe interrupted. The Empire struck first because they think we're weak. If we don't act, we'll prove them right. A low chime signaled the arrival of new data. A holographic display flickered to life, projecting the devastation in vivid detail. A series of images, smoldering ruins, twisted metal, and lifeless landscapes filled the room. The council looked away, but Joe forced himself to stare. He owed that much to the dead. I'll go, Joe said suddenly, breaking the silence. The room erupted into protests. You can't be serious, Greaves exclaimed. A lone diplomat challenging the Empire? It's suicide. Joe rose, his imposing frame casting a long shadow across the table. I'm not just a diplomat, Martin. I've sat across from their leaders, looked them in the eye. They know me. And more importantly, they know what I'm capable of. The council exchanged uneasy glances. Greaves leaned forward, desperation etched across his face. Joe, you're talking about abandoning protocol, about to hell with protocols. Joe's voice cut through the air like a blade. They didn't just break a treaty. They made it personal. And if they think Earth will roll over, they're in for a rude awakening. Silence fell again, heavier this time. Joe gathered his notes and turned toward the door, his movements purposeful. "You can't fight them alone," Greaves called after him. Joe paused, his hand on the doorframe. He didn't turn around. "Watch me." As the door slid shut behind him, the council members sat in stunned silence. Greaves buried his face in his hands. The others exchanged worried whispers, but none dared voice the thought lingering in all their minds. If Joe Garner couldn't stop the Empire, no one could. Joe strode through the gleaming corridors of the Capitol building, his mind racing. He would need to act quickly, decisively. His old instincts, dull but never forgotten, stirred to life. For years, he had buried that side of himself, the part that knew how to fight wars instead of preventing them. Now, it was all he had left. He entered his private office, sealing the door behind him. The room was stark, devoid of the personal touches that marked most diplomat spaces. A single photograph sat on the desk. A younger Joe, flanked by his brother and father, both long dead. He stared at it for a moment before sliding it into a drawer. "Activate secure channel," he commanded. A soft chime acknowledged his request, and a holographic interface appeared. Joe keyed in a series of codes, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. "Priority transmission to Fleet Command," he said, his voice steady. The screen blinked, and a grizzled face appeared. Admiral Marcus Stahl, Earth's military leader, regarded Joe with a mixture of respect and weariness. "Garner," Stahl said, his tone as unflinching as the man himself. "What the hell's going on?" "The Empire crossed the line," Joe replied. "I'm taking the fight to them." Stahl raised an eyebrow. "You've got guts. I'll give you that. But guts won't win this war." "No," Joe agreed. "But they might buy us enough time to figure out how to win." The Admiral studied him for a long moment before nodding. "You'll have my support. Just don't get yourself killed. Earth can't afford to lose you. Earth can't afford to lose, period." The transmission ended and Joe sat back, his jaw set. Outside the window, the stars glittered against the night sky, indifferent to the struggles of the beings who reached for them. Joe Garner wasn't indifferent. He couldn't be. The Empire had broken the peace, and they would answer for it. Joe Garner stood on the landing platform of Earth's orbital station, the cold void of space stretching endlessly beyond the reinforced glass. The transport ship before him was unimpressive. An aging courier vessel stripped of its insignias and loaded with just enough fuel to reach the heart of the galactic empire. It wasn't the kind of ship that inspired confidence, but Joe wasn't looking for inspiration. He was looking for a way in. Behind him, Admiral Marcus Stahl stepped closer, his boots echoing on the steel deck. "You're sure about this?" Stahl asked, his tone carrying an edge of concern. "This isn't just diplomacy anymore, Joe. You're walking into the lion's den with nothing but words and guts." "That's all I've ever needed," Joe replied without turning. His reflection in the glass was sharp, his gray eyes steady despite the chaos boiling inside him. He didn't mention the sidearm concealed beneath his jacket or the encrypted data drive strapped to his wrist. Words were his weapon, but he wasn't naive enough to rely on them alone. Stahl exhaled heavily, his breath misting the cold air. "You've got clearance to bypass their outer checkpoints, but once you're inside the Capitol, you're on your own. No backup, no extraction plan. You know that, right?" Joe nodded. "That's the point. If they see even a hint of Earth's fleet, they'll call it a provocation. I need them to think I'm here to beg for peace." "And are you?" Joe finally turned to face Stahl, his expression unreadable. "I'm here to remind them why they should fear us." Without another word, Joe ascended the ramp into the transport ship. The hatch sealed behind him with a hiss, and the hum of the engines vibrated through the hull. In the cockpit, the ship's AI interface flickered to life, a disembodied male voice greeting him. "Good evening, Mr. Garner," it said, its tone clipped and efficient. "Designation confirmed. Destination locked. Estimated travel time, 47 hours. Joe settled into the pilot's chair, his fingers brushing over the controls. Cut the pleasantries and just get us there in one piece. Affirmative, the AI replied, unbothered by his brusqueness. As the ship disengaged from the station and began its journey, Joe leaned back and closed his eyes. Sleep wouldn't come, he knew that much, but the solitude gave him space to think. The Galactic Empire's capital was a fortress of bureaucracy, its massive Senate building a labyrinth of alien architecture and endless corridors. Joe had been there twice before during peace negotiations, each time under the watchful eyes of imperial guards and disdainful senators. This time would be different. This time, he wasn't coming to plead. The journey passed in a blur of preparation. Joe reviewed the latest intelligence reports, memorized key details about the Empire's hierarchy, and replayed recordings of past Senate sessions to refresh his understanding of their political dynamics. He also rehearsed a speech he hoped he wouldn't need to give, the one promising fire and blood if the Empire didn't back down. When the ship finally dropped out of hyperspace, the capital loomed before him, a sprawling city world of spires and glowing conduits. Its central tower, the seat of the Galactic Senate, jutted into the atmosphere like a dagger aimed at the stars. The comm crackled as an Imperial officer hailed him. Unidentified vessel. State your purpose and provide clearance codes. Joe leaned forward, his voice calm and deliberate. This is Earth's Ambassador Joe Garner, requesting an audience with the Senate on urgent diplomatic matters. Transmitting clearance codes now. There was a long pause before the officer responded, his tone laced with suspicion. Proceed to Docking Bay 17. You will be escorted to the Senate chambers. Any deviation will result in immediate termination. Understood, Joe replied, suppressing a smirk. The Empire's arrogance was a weapon he planned to use against them. The docking bay was as imposing as Joe remembered. High ceilings, sterile lights, and squads of armored guards flanking every entrance. As he disembarked, a tall alien officer with emerald skin and piercing black eyes approached, her expression icy. Ambassador Garner, she said, her voice a low hiss. You've come a long way to deliver your surrender. Joe met her gaze, his tone steady. I'm here to prevent a war, not end one. She studied him for a moment before motioning for him to follow. The guards fell into formation around them, their weapons ready but not raised. Joe walked with measured steps, his hands clasped behind his back as if he were merely taking a stroll through a park. The Senate chambers were even more grandiose than he remembered, an amphitheater of alien delegates seated in concentric rings around a central podium. The air buzzed with tension as he entered, every eye, human and alien alike, fixing on him. Joe took his place at the podium, his heart pounding beneath his composed exterior. The Emperor, a towering figure draped in silver and crimson robes, sat at the highest point of the chamber, his expression a mask of detached authority. Ambassador Garner, the Emperor intoned, his voice echoing through the hall. You have come to address this assembly. Speak, and choose your words carefully. Joe inclined his head slightly, a calculated gesture of respect without submission. Esteemed members of the Galactic Senate, he began, his voice carrying just enough gravity to command attention. I stand before you not as a supplicant, but as a representative of humanity, a species you have wronged. A ripple of murmurs spread through the chamber, but Joe pressed on. The attack on our colonies was not an act of war. It was an act of cowardice. You struck at the edges of our reach, believing it would break our resolve. You were wrong. The Emperor raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. Bold words, Ambassador. But words alone cannot alter the balance of power. Joe smiled faintly, a predator's smile. You misunderstand me, Your Excellency. I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to give you a choice. Repair what you've broken or face the consequences. Laughter erupted from one of the delegates, a bulbous creature with eyes like molten gold. And what consequences could Earth possibly impose? Your fleet is a shadow. Your resources laughable. Joe reached into his jacket and retrieved the encrypted data drive, holding it aloft. This contains the locations of cloaked human warships currently positioned throughout your systems. One command from me, and they'll reduce your industrial hubs to rubble. The laughter died abruptly. The chamber erupted into chaos, delegates shouting over one another. The Emperor's expression darkened, his voice cutting through the noise. You expect us to believe this bluff? Joe inserted the drive into the podium's terminal. A holographic map of the Empire's territory appeared, red markers glowing ominously near critical planets. The room fell silent. I didn't come here to bluff, Joe said, his voice low but charged with menace. I came to offer you a way out. Call off your forces. Pay restitution for the lives you've taken. And perhaps, just perhaps, we can avoid turning your empire into a graveyard. The Emperor leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. You've overstepped, Ambassador. Joe's gaze didn't waver. Then do something about it. A taut wire ready to snap. Joe stood his ground, the weight of Earth's survival pressing on his shoulders, but failing to bow him. Whatever happened next, he knew one thing. The Galactic Empire would remember this day. The chamber trembled with a barely contained fury as the Emperor rose from his throne, his towering presence silencing even the boldest of the Senate delegates. The silver threads woven into his crimson robes caught the light, shimmering like the edges of a blade. His eyes, cold and calculating, locked on a Joe Garner with a weight that felt like gravity itself. You presume much, Ambassador, the Emperor began, his voice a low rumble that seemed to resonate within the walls. To stand here in the heart of my empire and issue ultimatums. This is either the height of bravery or the depths of foolishness. Tell me, which is it? Joe remained at the podium, his shoulders squared, his expression unreadable. It's necessity, he replied evenly. Your actions left me no choice. Humanity's survival demands this confrontation. The Emperor descended from his elevated platform with deliberate steps, his movements slow and measured. The tension in the room thickened with each footfall. The delegates, who moments ago had shouted over one another, now sat in uneasy silence, their gazes flicking between their ruler and the human who dared to challenge him. You speak of survival, the Emperor continued, circling the central podium like a predator stalking its prey. Yet your species clings to life like ants scurrying underfoot, building fragile empires that crumble at the first sign of true power. You come here flaunting the illusion of strength, but illusions have never frightened me. Joe's lips curled into a faint smile, though his pulse raced beneath the surface. Illusions don't leave scorch marks, Your Excellency. Your intelligence reports should confirm that much. The Emperor halted, his gaze narrowing. A clever retort, he admitted. But cleverness will not save you when the full weight of this empire turns its gaze upon your pitiful world. Do you think your threats of cloaked ships and sabotage will dissuade us? We are an empire of 1,000 systems. Your Earth is but a speck of dust in our path. Maybe, Joe said, his tone growing colder, sharper. But even a speck of dust can blind you at the wrong moment. And if you think humanity will simply bow and scrape like your other conquests, you've gravely underestimated us. The Emperor's jaw tightened, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his features. Joe had struck a nerve, though he knew that meant little in the long run. The Emperor's wrath was not something to be trifled with, but Joe had come prepared to weather it. You believe you can outmaneuver me, the Emperor said, his voice dropping into a near whisper that carried through the chamber like a hiss of steam. That you can force my hand with your bluster and posturing. But let me teach you a lesson, Ambassador, one that has crushed greater adversaries than you. With a flick of his wrist, the Emperor signaled to a cluster of guards stationed near the chamber's entrance. They moved with mechanical precision, activating a series of controls embedded in the Senate walls. A holographic projection flickered to life in the center of the room, displaying a live feed of a human colony, one of the few still untouched by the Empire's aggression. Joe's stomach dropped as the image sharpened. It was Ardendiz, a small agricultural hub orbiting a distant star, home to tens of thousands of civilians, families, children. As we speak, the Emperor continued, his tone icy. A fleet of our warships stands poised to strike this colony. A single command from me, and it will cease to exist. Your bravado will have cost you not only your life, but the lives of every soul on that world. The room seemed to shrink around Joe as he processed the gravity of the threat. The Emperor's game was brutal, direct, and devastatingly effective. Joe's mind raced, searching for a response that could buy time, shift the balance, anything. Destroying Ardendiz will prove nothing, Joe said finally, forcing his voice to remain steady. It will only confirm what I've told the Senate today, that the Empire values domination over diplomacy, terror over trust. Do you think the neutral systems will stand by as you commit another atrocity? You'll turn your own allies against you. The Emperor chuckled darkly, the sound devoid of humor. A noble attempt at deflection, Ambassador, but you overestimate the morality of those who watch from the sidelines. They value survival above all else, and aligning with strength is their nature. Destroying Ardendiz will only reinforce the inevitability of my rule. Joe took a slow breath, his mind clearing. He knew he couldn't save Ardendiz with words alone. He needed a decisive move, something that would upend the Emperor's narrative. Reaching subtly for his wrist, he activated the data drive's secondary protocol. The holographic map of the Empire's territories, still lingering on the podium's terminal, shifted. New markers appeared, glowing bright and ominous. This time, not around the Empire systems, but deep within its core worlds. Perhaps, Joe said, his voice sharpening like a blade, but even empires have vulnerabilities. The chamber fell into stunned silence as the map zoomed in on key Imperial planets. The markers highlighted critical infrastructure, shipyards, energy reactors, communications hubs, all of them prime targets for covert strikes. "What is this?" the Emperor demanded, his composure cracking for the first time. "Insurance," Joe replied, his tone cold as steel. "Call off your fleet, and those locations remain safe. Refuse, and Earth's allies. Yes, we have them. Will dismantle your empire from within." The Emperor's eyes burned with fury, his hand twitching as if he longed to strike Joe down where he stood. But he didn't. Not yet. "You're bluffing," the Emperor growled. "Am I?" Joe shot back, stepping closer to the edge of the podium. "Go ahead. Give the order to destroy Ardendiz. See what happens when your core worlds plunge into chaos. Your empire may survive the fallout, but you won't." The chamber held its breath, the weight of Joe's gamble pressing down on every soul present. The Emperor's gaze bore into him, unyielding, calculating. For a moment, the tension threatened to snap like an overstretched wire. Then, slowly, the Emperor lowered his hand. "You're a dangerous man, Ambassador Garner," he said, his voice a venomous whisper. "Far more dangerous than I anticipated." Joe allowed himself the faintest sigh of relief, though his face betrayed nothing. "I'm a man fighting for the survival of my people. That makes me dangerous, yes, but it also makes me determined." The Emperor turned to the assembly, his expression unreadable once more. "The Senate will deliberate," he announced, his tone commanding. "This session is adjourned." As the delegates filed out, their murmurs filling the air, the Emperor cast one last glance at Joe. It wasn't a look of defeat, nor was it one of victory. It was a promise that this conflict was far from over. Joe stood his ground, his fists clenched at his sides. The fight had only just begun, and he knew the Emperor's wrath would not be so easily contained. The hours following the Senate session stretched into a tense limbo. Joe Garner paced the sparse confines of his temporary quarters, the cool metal walls reflecting his determined expression. Every move he'd made in the chamber had been calculated, every word a piece of a larger strategy. But now, the next move wasn't his. It belonged to the Emperor. A soft chime broke the silence, followed by the AI's calm voice. Ambassador Garner, a summons has been issued. You are to return to the Senate chambers immediately. Joe inhaled deeply, steadying himself. The Empire's response would come swift and decisive, whether in the form of negotiation or retribution. He adjusted his jacket, ensuring the concealed sidearm was within reach, and exited his quarters. The halls leading to the Senate chambers buzzed with activity, delegates and aides murmuring in hushed tones. The tension was palpable, the air thick with the weight of decisions being made behind closed doors. As Joe entered the chamber, the delegates' eyes turned to him, their expressions a mix of curiosity, apprehension, and resentment. The Emperor sat at his throne, his posture regal and commanding. But there was something different in his demeanor, a trace of restraint, of forced calculation. The room fell silent as he raised his hand. Ambassador Garner, the Emperor began, his voice a controlled growl. You have thrust this Senate into a position it has not faced in centuries. Through audacity and cunning, you have challenged the Empire's supremacy. This cannot go unanswered. Joe met his gaze evenly, his pulse steady. I have no desire to undermine the Empire's authority, Your Excellency, only to ensure humanity's survival and independence. The Emperor's lips curled into a faint, humorless smile, spoken like a diplomat and a warrior. Yet your actions have forced us to consider a path we rarely tread. Compromise. A ripple of surprise swept through the chamber, but the Emperor silenced it with a sharp glance. He gestured to a holographic display that flickered to life in the center of the room. It depicted the Empire's vast territories, with Earth systems highlighted in blue. We will acknowledge humanity's sovereignty, the Emperor announced, his words measured and deliberate. Your colonies will remain under your governance, free from imperial interference. In return, Earth will recognize the authority of this empire and agree to a non-aggression pact. Joe's heart leaped, but he maintained his composure. And what of the restitution for the lives lost in your initial attack? The Emperor's eyes narrowed, a brief flash of annoyance breaking through his facade. A token reparation will be provided. Resources to rebuild what was destroyed. Do not mistake this for weakness, Ambassador. It is a gesture of restraint. Joe inclined his head, sensing the thin line he walked. Restraint can be as powerful as force, Your Excellency. Humanity accepts these terms, provided they are formalized in a binding agreement. The Emperor leaned forward, his gaze piercing. Do not think this ends here, Garner. This is but a temporary armistice. Your boldness has earned you a reprieve, but it has also painted a target on your back. One day, humanity will face the full might of the Empire. And when that day comes, you will remember this moment. Joe's expression hardened. When that day comes, Your Excellency, humanity will be ready. The chamber erupted into murmurs once more, the delegates reacting to the exchange with a mix of admiration and unease. Joe stepped back from the podium, his parting words hanging in the air like a challenge. As the session adjourned and the delegates began to disperse, a figure approached Joe, a human officer, one of the few stationed in the Empire as part of an earlier diplomatic envoy. Major Elias Kane was a stoic man with sharp features and a military bearing. You've got nerve, Garner, Kane said, his tone a mix of respect and incredulity. I didn't think anyone could get the Emperor to bend, even a little. Joe allowed himself a faint smile. It's not about bending. It's about showing them that we won't break. Kane nodded, his expression thoughtful. Still, you should watch your back. The Emperor's not the kind to forget being outmaneuvered, and there are plenty of others here who'd rather see Earth burn than admit we've earned our place. I'm counting on it, Joe replied. Let them plot and scheme. We'll be ready. As he made his way back to his ship, the weight of what he'd achieved began to settle on him. It wasn't a perfect victory, far from it. The Empire remained a looming threat, its power unchecked and its ambitions boundless. But for the first time, humanity had carved out a space for itself in the galactic order. In the cockpit of his transport ship, Joe activated the comm link, connecting to Earth's High Command. Admiral Stahl's face appeared on the screen, his expression a mix of relief and disbelief. "You did it," Stahl said, his voice carrying the weight of weeks of tension finally released. "We bought ourselves time," Joe corrected, his tone sober. "The Empire won't stop. But now, they'll think twice before underestimating us again." Stahl nodded, his gaze steady. "That's more than we could have hoped for. The fleet will stand ready if they try anything." "They will," Joe said. "It's only a matter of when. But when that day comes, we'll be stronger, more united, and they'll regret ever crossing us." As the ship disengaged from the capital's orbit and set a course for Earth, Joe allowed himself a moment of quiet reflection. The galaxy was vast, filled with dangers and uncertainties. But humanity had taken its first steps into that expanse, not as victims or vassals, but as equals. And Joe Garner, the diplomat who had faced the wrath of an empire and emerged unbroken, knew this was only the beginning. The stars were watching, and humanity was ready to shine.